Now it's time for our very special keynote speaker, PaulPerreault, CEO and Managing Director of CSL Limited. Mr. Perreault will be talking with us about the development of treatments and vaccines, including for COVID-19, from the perspective of a global biotech CEO. He has entitled his remarks, Innovating in Biotech, the Promises, Potential, and Pitfalls. I'm thrilled to be introducing Mr. Perreault, not just because under his leadership, CSL has become the 5th largest biotech company in the world, with more than 27,000 employees, bringing life-saving medicines to people in more than 100 companies, but also because he calls Utah home. He is one of us, a Utah resident living in Park City, running a global company. With 35 years of experience across both the global biotech and pharmaceutical industries, Mr. Perreault has well positioned CSL in the fight against COVID-19, with more than 5 R&D programs underway, including a potential plasma-derived coronavirus therapy, which is beginning a phase 3 clinical trial, and a COVID-19 vaccine. Let's welcome a very impressive fellow Utahn, Mr. PaulPerreault.
Thank you, Kelvin. And I assume everyone can hear me now. Hello to everyone. I'm happy to be with you here today, and I hope that your families and you all are healthy and safe. I want to thank the BioUtah team for inviting me here today. And for those of you who have served in the military, thank you for your dedication and service on this Veterans Day. And for those who have family members that have served, I also want to thank you for supporting them through their efforts. So, how does a CEO originally from Florida, who is leading the world's 5th or 3rd, depending on which day it is, largest biotech company, which is based in Australia, with operational headquarters in Pennsylvania, end up living and working in Utah? So why Utah? Well, it's a really good question, and it still sounds a bit odd to me, even as I was just saying. It's simply, Utah had always been one of my favorite places to visit with the family before my wife and I became full-time residents a number of years ago. The Beehive State, as you all know, has a lot to offer, including an outstanding quality of life. And we are avid skiers and hikers and cyclists and love the nature and natural beauty that's found here, which is unlike any place really that I've been around the globe. And from a business perspective, Utah has good access as well, thanks to the newly expanded Salt Lake City Airport, which directs flights to Europe. There's direct flights to Philadelphia. I can easily get to the West Coast and on to Australia. So having a large international airport that services all around the world is also quite helpful. Utah is also a lot closer to Australia than Pennsylvania. And I know that might sound funny, but I travel to and from Australia about 100 days a year. And the time difference between Australia and Utah is better and makes the business engagement easier. That 2 hours between the East Coast and the Utah time zone, the Mountain Time Zone, really makes a difference, because I can be done most of my calls with Australia, although not last night, but most of my calls with Australia before dinner, as opposed to taking them all through dinner. So I think it's fair to say the answer for me to why Utah is actually, of course, Utah's a perfect choice. Yet what I have really gained is a deep appreciation for, in Utah, is the world-class science. And it only goes to show with the award winners, and congratulations to all of them, the work that's been done here in the Beehive State. Utah possesses a very strong academic environment with Utah State, University of Utah, BYU, and many others, just to name a few. But there's a strong incubator system that I've seen in Utah. Small but promising biotechs have been calling Utah home for years. And as we saw with some of the award winners, they don't necessarily stay small. There's the ability to grow and expand. The area's emerging tech scene in and around Salt Lake City is also quite interesting to me, because with the earned nickname of the Silicon Slope, word is getting out that Utah has a vibrant scientific scene that's thanks in part to the good work that Kelvin and BioUtah and all of you are doing to help tell the state's life science story. But I like the combination of tech and science together to really see how we're going to move forward. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as I get on to innovation. But there's no question, there's exceptional science here in Utah. And while some may say Utah science may be a bit of a secret, I can assure you it's not going to be a secret for much longer. The same can also be said, really, and the parallels I draw about the company that I lead, which is CSL. So who are we at CSL? It's really a good question. It's not exactly a household name in the US for a couple of reasons. Our core business, first of all, treats people with rare diseases like bleeding disorders and immune deficiencies, like things like the boy in the bubble, where people are born with a non-functioning or no immune system. And just by the essence of rare disease and the number of patients being not in a massive scale, like you would see in oncology, for instance, unless you know somebody with these diseases, a lot of times you wouldn't have heard of CSL. Secondly, we're headquartered in Melbourne, Australia. The company's roots go back, and I'll talk briefly about that. And so our shares, we actually are listed on the Australian Stock Exchange. And although Australia is a great place, and I don't mean this in a mean way, it's at the bottom end of the earth. That's just geographic fact, right? So it is half a world away from here. And it's not a household name for that reason. We're not on Kramer's Mad Money, following the tech stocks because he doesn't normally cover the ASX. But we are actually the largest company on the Australian Stock Exchange. So over $140 billion Australian market cap. So although we're not a household name in the US, we certainly do get our fair share of attention in Australia and around the globe. So as we think about the commonality of how we actually drive innovation, I think we have to think about the Utah Life Science and what CSL share in terms of commonality, and that's innovation. I know there were some sessions yesterday discussing growing on innovation culture, which is important to create an innovative environment. And later I'll share my perspective on what I think is required to really enable innovation to flourish, both now and post-COVID. But innovation has been in the DNA of CSL from the start. It continues as the basis of everything that we do today across the global organization. So I'd like to spend just a minute on CSL's background because it's important in understanding our deep commitment to innovation for saving and improving the lives of people around the world. CSL was formed in Melbourne, Australia as a government agency with a simple but important promise that is core to who we are, which is providing critical medicines to people. The people of Australia relied on CSL to deliver important medicines, and we fully embraced that responsibility for decades. For CSL, this has been more than a commitment, it's a promise, and we're driven by that promise to this very day. We actually privatized from the Australian government in 1994. And again, just not a surprise to many of you, but being run by the government for about 75 years, it wasn't necessarily a thriving organization at that time. Government does a lot of great things, but running a commercial enterprise with changes in the investment schemes doesn't always give you the best outcomes. But in 1994, CSL started to globalize and expand outside of Australia. And as a result, 26 years later, CSL has grown significantly, as I said, to become now the third largest biotech company, providing medicines to people in over 100 countries around the globe. The next thing I would say about CSL is that we're comprised of two businesses. We have CSL Behring and Seqirus. CSL Behring is our biotherapeutics business, and this represents about 90% of the company's revenue and profitability and delivers life-saving medicines for people with rare and serious diseases. As part of CSL Behring, we also have CSL Plasma because a lot of our rare disease medicines actually come from proteins that we extract and fractionate from plasma. And CSL Plasma is one of the world's largest and most efficient plasma networks. CSL Plasma collects and we also import raw material for developing and producing these plasma-based therapies to treat people with these bleeding disorders, immune deficiencies, neurological disorders, respiratory disorders, and many others. We have more than 280 plasma collection centers, including 2 in Utah, 1 in Salt Lake City and the other in Midvale. And I'd be remiss if I didn't pause here and encourage you to donate plasma. You'll be helping to save and improve another person's life. And we're also collecting convalescent plasma from those donors that have contracted COVID and recovered. Seqirus is our influenza vaccines business and about 10% of CSL's revenue. Seqirus is the world's second largest manufacturer of flu vaccines and a major partner for securing public health and the prevention of control of flu globally. I also would encourage you to get your flu shot if you haven't already. And with COVID being active, scientists are saying getting a flu shot this year will hopefully avoid what they've been calling a twindemic. We know that the hospitals and the intensive care units are full, and it's great that we have testing, as was pointed out by one of our winners here for both influenza and for COVID. But we really need to make sure that we're protected. I get 2 flu shots each year, one for the Northern Hemisphere and the other for the Southern, since I typically travel half my time and also in Australia for quite a bit of the year. Better safe than sorry, I'd say. So just like many organizations, CSL needs to be agile. We have to adapt to the evolving environment. That is all things COVID, both operationally as well as applying our science and our capabilities in response to the pandemic. We have very deliberately focused our energies on matching our science with our technical capabilities and facilities around the world. Monoclonal antibodies, hyperimmunes, and vaccines. They're all in our wheelhouse. If you created an organization to respond to COVID, the organization might look a lot like CSL. We currently have multiple R&D programs underway focused on both treating and preventing COVID-19. And a few highlights really are the vaccines development. You may have heard our Chief Medical Affairs Officer, Dr. Greg Sylvester, for the Seqirus business discuss our COVID-19 vaccine program on Monday morning during the sessions. We have a partnership with the University of Queensland and CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovations, to accelerate, manufacture, and distribute a vaccine should it be approved. And we have an agreement with AstraZeneca and the Oxford University vaccine candidate. Also agreements with the Australian government to support the production of both of those vaccines. In terms of hyperimmunes, the plasma industry is uniting to develop a hyperimmune. CSL is one of the founding members of the COVID-19 Plasma Alliance to develop a potential plasma-derived hyperimmune therapy for the treatment of serious complications from COVID in the US and Europe. Phase 3 clinical trials are underway. We are currently recruiting. We have a number of patients in the trial already, and we're hoping for the initial results before the end of this year. The product would be IV and administered therapy comprised of COVID antibodies. So many of you have heard of Lilly's, which has about 3 monoclonal antibodies. This is utilizing our immune globulin to actually have this shotgun approach of polyclonal antibodies in a hyperimmune product. I think I can speak for everyone in biotech when I say that fighting COVID-19 is personal for all of us. Most of us have had friends, family members, colleagues that have been impacted by COVID. The sense of urgency, I don't think is lost on any of us. Of course, in our industry, whether it's COVID related or not, being patient focused also requires being innovative. For CSL, our medicines for people living with rare and serious diseases are not discretionary medicines. They are a necessity. Our role in ensuring patients have access to these medicines is it's really imperative. This isn't an afterthought for us. Personally, innovation is what motivates me to come to work every day. And innovation is how organizations, all of our organizations, are providing value back to stakeholders and communities in which they serve and operate. So innovation is exactly what I want to focus on today, from its promise to its potential and its pitfalls. So moving on to the next slide, at CSL, we think a lot about innovation and collaboration. In fact, I never stop thinking about it. I'm sure many of you do too. And while COVID-19 has created challenges that are unprecedented, I mean, I now have 2 full-time jobs because COVID came about when we were already fully occupied. The pandemic has also demonstrated that the scientific community can do what we can do when we collaborate. In fact, I'm not sure the scientific community has ever come together so rapidly as it has right now to help fight COVID. There are so many examples of competitors across industries coming together to collaborate in order to drive innovation. And now when people think about innovation, they often naturally gravitate towards R&D. Like many of you, I am certainly investing and expanding our global R&D capabilities because we believe it's the engine that can really help drive our sustainable growth as an organization. Innovation, however, can be enterprise-wide in finance, HR, across the business. We need people to constantly think and act progressively. We should strive to apply innovative ideas that continuously improve our decision-making, our processes, our systems, regardless of industry, academia, or where we sit in the organization. I would say the common catalyst, really, for delivering on the promise of innovation requires leadership. We need leadership that is engaging leadership. We need leadership that is focused leadership, and we need future-oriented leadership. Yet sustainable innovation must come from more than the C-suite. That's why I believe leaders today at all levels really need to rethink their roles in the innovation process. Anymore, it's not enough for leaders to ask, how do I make innovation happen? There needs to be a paradigm shift in leaders' thinkings to influence and impact others, like asking, how do I enable innovation? How do I create the environment for innovation? How do I remove obstacles for others to be innovative in what they do each and every day? There's really three pivotal leadership pieces in what I'd like to call leading for innovation, which I'd like to touch on right now. Number one, find the intersections where innovation can happen. Number two, reward and recognize innovation across your organization. And third, foster a culture of diversity and inclusion. Together, these three elements can help a team or broader organization create a conducive environment which enables innovation to occur and flourish. Many of the award winners that you heard about earlier talked about growing their organization and having to depend on other people. That's where you really have to make sure that this innovation culture, this innovation environment is well placed to be able to grow your organizations. So to ensure that the current and future innovation processes do not deliver an empty promise, we need to understand a bit more about how we can unleash and really harness that innovation. This is a fundamental paradox, in my view, when thinking about innovation. So first, we as leaders must recognize that innovation often happens at these intersections and encourage the intersections to occur. So how do we recognize an innovative intersection? It may involve combining talent from different places or simply taking on new experiences in one's own career. It may also be in response to a global healthcare crisis like we're experiencing today. One of the recent intersections in healthcare that we're watching closely and has been a bit unprecedented, and many of you have probably heard of it, known as Haven, was really taking banks like JP Morgan, taking people like Amazon, and then Berkshire Hathaway, and these three companies pooling together to aim and provide US employees with a simplified, high quality and transparent healthcare. Now, no one knows for sure if they'll be successful, but the intersections they forged are intriguing and potentially a bit scary and a bit uncomfortable for people. You know, coming out to Utah, I also enrolled in MyChart, and it was interesting to see that across, whether it was the U or Intermountain Health or some of the other healthcare delivery networks, that people can now get access to my records. That's really something we've been striving for years. So, you know, we're getting there little by little in terms of innovation. The life science industry is constantly forging intersections that result in a more porous science ecosystem. Today, it's really not uncommon for innovative ideas to start or finish in somebody else's lab, not necessarily in my lab, for instance. And we've seen even more examples of this since the pandemic began, including our own vaccine collaboration with the University of Queensland that I mentioned earlier. So even before COVID-19, our scientists often worked alongside people who may or may not be located in their country or time zone, or even within our company. Some of our scientists are even co-located with academic researchers. For example, our global hub for research and translational medicine is located at the University of Melbourne in Australia, where our scientists work side by side and exchange ideas with their academic counterparts. We also probably get access to more human tissue samples than almost any other company by having this close collaboration. The second key to helping your team access the full potential of innovation is really to promote and reward it across the organization. Innovation isn't just about coming up with new products, right? It's about how we as leaders organize and engage our people. It's about how we improve our processes, introduce the new technologies, and remove obstacles for people so that innovation can actually flourish. As leaders, we should ask ourselves, how can we engage all parts of the organization to do things better, faster, and more efficiently? I always say, I'm from corporate, I'm here to help. Not everybody actually thinks that's true in my organization. That's one of the things you learn as leaders. If we're really mean what we say, we have to help people remove obstacles and get on with the work. So are you finding that your teams are so engrossed in their work that there's no time for anything else? Try something counterintuitive. Give your people time and space to consider how they might do things differently. Give them some time during the day. Say, get off the project, take an hour. I just want you to think about how things are going and what we can do better in the organization. I feel strongly about hiring the right people. I often tongue-in-cheek joke with people and say these jobs would be easy if it weren't for people. But you have to get the right people that understand your culture, that understand your mission, that have the passion and the drive to help us get to where we need to be. Time's wasted, patients are waiting. So ensuring they understand the mission and that commitment to doing business in the right way. I can't sit in my office and lead. I believe in knowing your people like you know your business. And it's hard when you grow your company, as many people have talked about when they receive their awards. It's hard to know everybody today. When I started in this organization, we had about 3,000 employees. We're now at 27,000 employees across 37 countries in the world. I mean, this is a big company. I don't know everyone anymore, but I like to do management by walking around, because no matter how large the business becomes, I try to keep the organization at least feeling like it's a small organization. And without that big name in the US, for instance, when people come to CSL, they said, gee, I didn't know the company was this big. I said, yeah, well, it's a pretty well-kept secret. We used to be the biggest company nobody's heard of, and now we're the biggest company some people have heard of. But I continuously meet with employees, both formally and informally in settings, including now virtually, and soliciting their feedback. When I moved to Utah, and my wife found out I could be home about 15 days more a year in my travel, especially back and forth to Australia, I didn't know that I could actually work virtually, well enough from Utah. It was a bit of an experiment. But I have to say, I wasn't the visionary that knew COVID was coming, because now we're all kind of working in this environment. And we still have to innovate around the way we're working today, just like this 3-day work that's going on virtually. But because of engagement with people, I'd like to think that our people feel informed and they feel valued. They're better able to do their jobs, take ownerships of their roles, and feel empowered to make decisions. We have to drive decision-making down to the lowest possible levels in the organization, as long as people know their guardrails for making those decisions. Communication is key. And finally, I guess the third lesson for tapping the potential of innovation is to ensure that diverse perspectives are heard, valued, respected, and cultivated. I love the example of engineers in the medical community and scientists coming together, because that's exactly what's needed for most of what we do. A diverse and inclusive culture can help an organization better understand and connect to customers and other stakeholders. It improves the quality of decision making. And importantly, it also helps us attract and retain the best and brightest people. Ensuring we develop and deliver the best science and the best therapies and influenza vaccines for patients and public health really hinges on our ability to innovate. And that really means that, as we continue to innovate, the workplace culture in which our workforce is engaged has to be inspired and motivated to bring their best to the table every day. They have to be authentic selves to work every day. At CSL, we've seen firsthand how our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion across our organization has not only made our workplace stronger, it's made our work stronger too. We rely on our people's diverse perspectives, ideas, capabilities, and experiences to help us deliver on our promise to patients and public health. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is good for our people, it's good for business, it's good for our donors, it's good for our patients. And keeping your focus on what's right for the stakeholder or customer can help you harness that diversity to fuel innovation. Not only is diversity driving innovation at CSL, but it's attracting external recognition too. Forbes has named CSL among the world's best employers for 4 consecutive years. Thomson Reuters also ranked us the last 2 years in the 100 companies in its Global Diversity and Inclusion Index. And as a leader, I think about how we can encourage diverse perspectives. It's not about the accolades or the recognition, but people will know if you're doing the right things by the way you behave in your culture. So at CSL, we consistently engage with patient groups, researchers, policymakers, physicians, pharmacists, and others. We're constantly collaborating to advance the science, improve patient access to care, and influence public policy to help patients and public health. So the pitfalls of innovation, I would say while collaboration and diversity and inclusion are important, they're not foolproof in terms of how you're going to be successful. Now, I've been around the block enough times to see some innovation pitfalls. I mentioned earlier this paradox of unleashing and harnessing the process of innovation. And in order to unleash the ability to innovate, we have to let individuals run a bit. But to harness it, you'll need the collective group. So you need that individual contribution, but you also need the group to really engage it and make it happen. So to unleash, you need to support the process, but you need to harness it. But in order to harness it, you have to confront and challenge the process. To unleash, you need to have learning and development, but you have to harness how you make people perform. To unleash this innovation, you have to improvise, but really to harness it and drive it, you have to have structure. Patience is crucial to unleashing the power of innovation, but you have to have urgency in order to harness it because things move quickly and you can get surpassed very fast. And lastly, you have to manage both the bottom up and from the top down. And I'll tell you, it's hard work. So you can see this dichotomy and this paradox of, you really want people to perform individually because they're really smart, but you have to get the group together to really drive it. And I think that's where companies, and many of you have had these experiences, that as you grow, this is what makes growth difficult as you're continuing to try to innovate. So one of the more common pitfalls to be aware of is the failure to look ahead and to take advantage of what's changing. Although we're still in the midst of the pandemic and continuing to navigate uncertainty in the near term, I still spend a good portion of my time planning for our 2030 strategy, and I expect our company's senior leaders to do the same. That includes looking at population demographics, economic forecasts, climate change, current and future sources of competitions, and disruptive technologies. And while many factors are outside our control, as 2020 has so clearly demonstrated, I think we're all ready for 2020 to be over. Our job as leaders is to organize and engage our people to tap into the potential for innovation. Did you know that by 2030, millennials will occupy the majority of managerial roles? Also, post-millennials or Gen Z born with smartphones in their hands will be at the start of their careers and represent those who are entering the workforce. Not only does the changing role of technology impact your culture, but it impacts what your stakeholders and what your customers will expect from us. Successful organizations over the next decade are likely to be the ones that digitally transform both their internal operations and their interactions with stakeholders. I think that's why it's important that we really embrace the Silicon Slope with BioUtah to think about how we can work together with the digital transformation that's going to be required into the future. It's not about big data. We've got tons of data. We need the right data with the ability to extract the right information from the data. There's tons of data. We need information to make the right decisions to innovate. This year, I've also created a new Chief Digital Information Officer role reporting directly to me. I think it's important that if I believe in digital transformation, that the role has the visibility and the support to actually get it done in the organization. Sometimes CDIOs or heads of IT or BT sit in other areas reporting to a CFO or someone else. But I think it's important. So I hired Mark Hill. He's a strong, established leader with worked at Merck and Gilead and a number of other companies to really transform this digital biotech company that we have, to lead the organization through that transformation. I spoke earlier about the importance of learning agility. The lack of agility, the lack of understanding market dynamics, the lack of creative thought processes has really been the bane of many companies. They failed to recognize the potential for innovation. And it could be because they got too comfortable. Maybe they weren't considering the disruptive threats. Somebody my age, the younger people in the audience may not even know these companies, but companies like Kodak and Polaroid and digital imaging, think of Xerox and Compaq and personal computing. Retailers, what happened to Toys R Us? What happened to Tower Records? I used to hang out at Tower Records, and Blockbuster Video. Pan Am, what happened to Pan Am Airlines? There's many household names that you can think of that these companies have disappeared because they either thought they were too big to fail or they didn't innovate what they were doing. So today we have names like Amazon, Netflix, Uber. The reality is you either innovate or you manage your exit. And it's never been so true than it is in biotech. Finally, leaders must also encourage their teams to leverage advanced analytics and artificial intelligence. This will augment the human capabilities, provide insights, and hopefully allow us to do more thinking on our own to really drive what's happening with the digital space. The second potential pitfall is a lack of focus, and particularly on transformational innovation. And regardless of your sector or industry, you must focus innovation on what is best for your end user, your customer, your stakeholder. Consistently do the right things for your most important stakeholder, and people will believe in your efforts. For us at CSL, our number one focus is the person or patient who will benefit from our medicines. When we do that well, everything else seems to follow. Focus and innovation have been good for business too. When we were first listed on the Australian Securities Exchange 26 years ago, CSL's annual revenue is 136 million Australian. And since then, our annual revenue has grown to over 9 billion US. Our stock price has more than tripled over the last 5 years. We've more than doubled the number of our employees in 6 years. And our relentless focus on innovation for our patient has been the catalyst for that growth. Now, I mentioned the share price, but I have to tell you, that's not what I care about, because that's not really where the innovation stems from. If you're doing the right things, the share price and the stock exchange, that becomes the scoreboard. It's not the game plan. And that's where companies also run into pitfall focus, because they're focused on the wrong thing. So focus is important in terms of avoiding pitfalls, but it's also important to understand that if you're focused on the wrong things, that can be in itself the pitfall. So in some parts of biopharma, some players are too preoccupied with the short-term growth and they take the easy way out. They produce, some Me Too medicines or incrementally better than existing options, rather than focusing on therapies that will be transformational for patients in the broader world. And I have to tell you, in the global environment, all governments, all countries are looking for that change and innovation. It's no longer good enough just to have something that's a little better. They're looking for transformational products for patients. We're in the area where these governments are not going to pay for these Me Too products. So reimbursement is going to become an issue if we're not innovating. In contrast, those medicines that are significantly better, payers see the value, they can calculate the value and the impact on the healthcare system, and they'll reimburse for those products. Sometimes this pursuit of innovation means shelving a good idea because it isn't what the customer needs, or because it isn't scalable, or because another idea is more promising. Sometimes you're in an industry that competes on innovation. It can be tempting to chase what's trending. That's a great way to burn through resources. It's a great way to burn through capital. So unless that thing you're chasing fits within your area of focus, really give it another thought. I have to say that, I'm not always the most loved person in the organization because of this focus word. We recently stopped an R&D project that had been going on for about 3 or 4 years that, my scientists were deeply embedded in, and they loved it. And you know what? Scientifically, it was phenomenal. It just so happened that another company in the meantime developed a therapy that made the market possibility for this product obsolete. And so I stopped the program. It's hard to stop R&D programs, I can tell you. People get very sensitive about, their work. And I understand that from a science perspective. And it was really good science. It's just there's no market for it. And we have other things that need to come to market. So we had to reprioritize and focus on those areas. We know that what our core competencies are at CSL. We try to avoid chasing shiny objects that provide short-term gains. And when we enter a market, it's for the long haul. I don't enter a market and then if there's shortages of product or pricing gets, shorter or not reimbursed, we say, well, we're moving it somewhere else. Patients don't like that. Governments don't like that. And that's not the right thing to do as an organization. This resonates with our patients and our stakeholders where we do business. The communities in which we work have to know that we're going to keep our promises. Third innovation really in pitfalls is the failure to engage your stakeholders early and often. You have to be part of the conversation around what the stakeholder or customer needs and what they value. What is the problem statement you're trying to solve for? Start the conversations early, have them often, listen and listen closely. Our industry often talks about how they're going to impact the market and what the next product's going to be. And to do this, we have to go out and engage with patients in the community to really understand what their needs are. You can leverage technology to do this, but don't miss out on the value of engagement in the interactions. And it gets harder when we're working remotely. You have to actually schedule that time. At CSL, we work with patients for patients. Patient input was the impetus for CSL developing and delivering several of our transformational medicines. But we don't stop there. In fact, the most common request I get from patients is, please keep innovating. There's still a lot of art left in medicine. It used to be called the art of medicine, and I think there still is a lot of art. We're very smart people. There's a lot of science that we know a lot, but there's a lot we still don't know. And I would say that we can't stop innovating. We have to keep learning. The complexities of the human body, the interaction with the environment, the development and transmission of disease, we really need to understand this even more than we ever have in the past. That's why tech hubs, like the one that continues to grow here in Utah, where collaboration and innovation thrive, are so important to advancing scientific innovation. This is also why a CEO like myself, who's originally from Florida, who leads an Australian biotech with roots in Pennsylvania, feels right at home in Utah. So just in closing, I'd just like to say at the end of this conversation, every strategy, every innovation is really about a person whose safety and health is in the hands of our company. These are our patients who believe in us and trust in us. And I encourage all of our people to work each day like a person's life depends on it. You know what? Because it usually does. I can't think of a better motivator to come to work and innovate. In closing, I hope the insights today gave you somewhat of a different perspective on the promise and the potential and some of the pitfalls that we can have in innovation, but also will prompt your interest in connecting with us. I invite you to follow our company's progress on our social media channels. And I want to thank you all, and really a great opportunity to be able to speak to such a prestigious group and a group that's doing so much good for patients and for the state of Utah. Kelvin, thank you so much. And I don't know if we have time, but if we have time and like to answer some questions, happy to do so.
Paul, thank you very much. This has been just fascinating. We're very fortunate to have you in our midst and to learn more about CSL Behring. I'm sure one of the first questions people are going to ask is when are you going to move some manufacturing operations here?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've been working on my skis in the back room, but I'm not sure that qualifies. But look, we do have 2 plasma centers here, which is actually small manufacturing operations, but we are looking to expand around the United States. And we do have to look at these biotech hubs. We've recently started a collaboration in Philadelphia with the University Science Center at the University of Pennsylvania. And I think there could be some other areas because, as I said, when I look at focus, Kelvin, and I think about the opportunities, I had some board members at one time who spent a lot of time in big pharma, and they said, well, you need to have a hub in Boston. I'm like, why would I do that? Why would I go to Boston and compete with every other biotech in the US that's trying to make it in Cambridge at high price, high rent, and tough competition to keep talent? Or why would I go to Northern California, and those areas where everybody knows that, and yeah, there's a lot of capabilities there. But when I've learned more about what's happening in Utah, I'm very excited about the promise of doing more here locally in Utah to really collaborate on a number of the projects that we're working on. So I think as we get through COVID, because as I said, we're so fully occupied with 2 full-time jobs right now, and certainly with my presence here, I'm very interested in seeing what we can do better and more broadly here in Utah.
Well, when we have the CEO himself here, that's already an awfully good start. So we appreciate that. I really enjoyed your remarks. I feel like it says something about my character that I related more to the pitfalls discussion than anything, but it was really fascinating to hear. And I guess I should go down and follow your lead and make some contributions of plasma, since I'm a recovered COVID-19 patient. So that's something we should all consider. If people have questions for Paul, we would like to invite you to type them into the Q&A on your screen. There's a little icon at the bottom. You can certainly do that. And while we're doing that, I do have a couple of more questions, Paul, I'd like to ask you. There are more than 100 different COVID-19 vaccines that are under development around the world. Some will be effective and some won't. Does the world really need that many COVID vaccines, or do you see that consolidating?
Well, first, Kelvin, I'd say that there is a lot of promise, just like my talk, and innovation with COVID vaccines. But I am under no delusion that all these vaccines will be successful. I can tell you that there's still a heck of a lot of work to do. We've never worked this quickly on vaccines. I mean, you know, you might have heard of Gardasil, which is for HPV. Came from our labs in Australia. We had Merck develop it. It took 17 years to get it to market. So I can tell you that this is really hard work to make vaccines. AstraZeneca, you know, we work very closely with, and we're going to be manufacturing, if it's successful, their vaccine in Australia and for parts of Asia Pac. But I have to say that, you know, they're not vaccine manufacturers. They're doing it because of their relationship with Oxford. And so they've done a great job at scaling up. But, you know, these are hard things to do, and not everything will be successful. There will be side effects. There will be, you know, some immunogenicity issues with a number of these vaccines. Some are small biotechs that don't have the scale up. The other thing is, quite frankly, you know, the supplies. I mean, the number of vials that are going to be needed. And remembering that these vaccines, most of them won't have a preservative, which means that as soon as you make it, you also have to, once you pop the vial, you have to get people lined up. So if you have 20 doses in a vial, you better get at least 20 people lined up when you stick that needle through for the first dose, because within 12 to 24 hours, it all has to be out of the vial, or else it's going to go bad. So, you know, these are things that people don't think about in terms of how vaccines are made, you know, what it's going to take. And we will need billions of doses. We haven't seen yet a vaccine in development in even the Pfizer news that came out this week. You know, there were 96 positive patients, but the trial is 46,000 patients, right? There are 46,000 people that are being recruited for that trial. It's a huge trial, and that's what you need in a vaccine when you're going to be, you know, pinging a couple of billion people. The other thing is, as you saw, as with our vaccine that we're developing with the University of Queensland, which is a protein-based vaccine from a Lonza cell line that we've manufactured from in the past, you're going to probably need 2 doses. That's what we're seeing so far in just about all of these vaccines, which means that you're going to need more vaccines, and you're going to need a way to scale it and develop it. Moderna has an interesting idea, but, you know, we've never made an RNA vaccine before. Never made an RNA-based vaccine. It's also very unstable, so it's a frozen product. So distribution and all these things. I think we're going to need as many vaccines as possible to really make sure that we get the response in the community's infusions that we need with these vaccines. These things are not, you know, for herd immunity, the only way really to get herd immunity is with vaccines. And so I think we need as much as possible.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. That's for sure. And there's so much, as you said earlier, that we don't know right now. And so lots of options certainly will make a difference. One thing that fascinated me about your comments, and you alluded to this several times, when you began with CSL, it was a much smaller company. I think you said it was in the 169 million in sales, and now it's 9 billion. And you were at like 3,000 employees, and now it's 27,000 employees. So you've seen that growth and presided over much of that growth. What has been the major challenge in facilitating that growth? I mean, it's not an easy thing to grow a company. As Randy Rasmussen said earlier, you have a CAGR that's doubling every year over 5 years, but in your case, it was much larger than that. How do you manage that, and what were the biggest challenges?
Well, as I pointed out, Kelvin, I think one of the biggest challenges is getting the right people in the organization. CSL is a great organization, but we're not perfect. I mean, no company is perfect, right? I mean, we all have our own idiosyncrasies, and CSL isn't for everyone. I mean, but our culture is one that we stand by our values. And if we have people that aren't living the values of the company, I'll help them find a job with another company. That's not being mean. That's just, if you're going to be true to the underpinnings of your company in terms of how you behave and how you operate, you have to make sure that you're sincere. You have to be authentic. I mentioned that earlier. It's about authenticity in terms of how you do it. But I think the biggest issue we've had is one, really trying to grow at a pace to keep up with the demand for many of these life-saving products, and doing it in the right way to make sure that you're not over-promising and under-delivering. That's a way to not only make your customers and stakeholders and patients upset, but it's also a way to disenfranchise your employees. So it's about having the right game plan and sticking to it with the focus. As I said, not getting entertained with shiny objects. We've been very fortunate to have a base of business that's growing at a very strong rate. And on top of that, we don't have to go out and do an acquisition for our growth, which many companies have had to do. They go out and they struggle for growth. They have huge patent cliffs, and many of our products are not in that position. So it's been a very it's not easy to do, because you do lose touch and you have to have process, and you get behind in certain areas because of the fast growth, and you have to catch up. But you have to maintain a discipline, and you have to maintain that focus, and try to make sure that people understand what we're driving for, and that there's clear, constant communication across the organization where people know where you're going. We do engagement surveys with the population to make sure that we're not losing track of what people are thinking and feeling in the organization, because I can no longer just go out and talk to every employee. So it takes time, it takes effort, it takes focus, it takes management leadership, and holding people accountable for living the values and the culture of the organization.
Well, that's certainly transformational when you go through that kind of growth. You make some of it sound so simple, but yet
Yeah.
the execution has just got to be horrendous. I can't even imagine what the execution would be like. One of our listeners, John Norp with Merit Medical, has this question for you. He says, how can the pace of innovating COVID-19 vaccines increase should the virus change and no longer be effectively treated by vaccines currently in development?
Well, thanks for the question, John. I would say that it's going to be very, very difficult, because people are so focused right now on trying to get this vaccine out for the current strains and the current what we know about the current strains, that if there is shift or drift of the virus, it's going to be very difficult to pivot that quickly. Now, again, with some of the vaccines, it might be easier than others, but I have to say that just adding another antigen or to try to boost the immunogenicity for a strain change or a drift or shift of virus will be quite difficult. What we've seen so far is that the virus is fairly stable. It doesn't seem to be mutating too rapidly, which is helpful, but it doesn't mean it won't. And so I would say that the industry that's the other reason to your first question, Kelvin, that I think multiple vaccines give us optionality. So as some vaccines will be in different stages of development, some will move faster, some will move slower. Maybe there's an opportunity to utilize some of those other technologies to shift if there's a change.
Okay, very good. A year ago, no biotech company in the world knew there was going to be a global pandemic, let alone the needs for the development of both vaccines for prevention and therapies for treatment. So how does a biotech leader like CSL balance the immediate needs of responding to the COVID with new vaccines and therapeutics while advancing and operating the rest of your R&D portfolio and business? You've talked about that a little bit, but maybe address that head on.
So we've reprioritized, right? I mean, there are R&D projects that we've slowed down, some that we've sped up, and others that we've stopped for the time being, in order to handle the various changes that we have within COVID. So as I said, the hyperimmune program, we're working with 5 industry partners to try to develop this plasma-based hyperimmune product. With COVID in Asia Pac and Australia, we're working with AZ, but we're not actually doing the clinical trials. We're going to be manufacturing the vaccine if it's successful, because we have facilities in Australia to do so. But with the UQ vaccine, we're doing all the development work, the clinical trials, everything for that vaccine. And then the antibodies, we're running the trials as well. With the hyperimmune program, we're working with NIH. So we're using some of their resources to actually run that trial. But it's about focus and priorities, Calvin, and it's hard. It's really hard. That's where people, worry about it. But I have to say the resilience and agility in an organization really show that stripes in a time like this. And that's what I've seen with our group, is that they've embraced the fact that we have to respond, and that some of the core projects that, or the projects that they love to work on are going to have to be altered maybe in terms of some of the timelines. We did see obviously a slowdown in a number of our R&D projects just because of COVID, where all the clinical trials that we're running, we're running a clinical trial right now in cardiovascular disease that's in 1,000 sites in 50 countries. And so that stopped basically for about 3 or 4 months because the hospitals were waiting for the influx of COVID patients, and they couldn't, run the clinical trials the way that we thought was going to be the right way to run the trial. We want to maintain the integrity for the patients as well as the integrity of the data that's being collected at those sites without the distraction of COVID. So it's a mix of, what stopped because of COVID, how we reprioritized, and then how we utilized our resources to really focus on the things that matter right now. And that's hard for an organization to do as well.
Oh boy, I would say so. Growing and being as big a company as you are now, you have a board of directors that you work with. Every CEO that is listening today would probably like to know, how have you as a CEO made the best use of your board of directors, and what counsel would you give to CEOs of companies in working with their board of directors?
I've canceled all the board meetings. No, just kidding. Look, I think the thing that I look for from my board is insight into strategic optionality, right? To me, strategy is about optionality. So really taking a look at, in the focus that we maintain in the company, where are the options? What are our core adjacencies, core capabilities, and core competencies? So I really rely on the board to help us think through strategy, number one. Number two, I look for governance, because that's really what the boards are there to help protect the company, to make sure we have the right governance, to make sure we're not losing our way, to make sure that things are operating the way they need to do from some of the boring things that we have to do. So whether it's audit and risk committee meetings, which are quite important in our business, the finance meetings, and we have an innovation and development committee on the subcommittee on the board that actually is comprised of mostly our folks in industry and not the accountants or the lawyers, but that really look at our projects and our portfolio of R&D and give commentary, insight. We manage the portfolio as management, but it's also making sure that you understand what is management's role, what is the board's role, and how can the two help each other in those areas. So I would say, don't be afraid of your boards. Don't think that they're just there to get in your way. If you think they are, or if that's what they're doing, then maybe you need to refresh the board. But it really needs to be a collaborative relationship. It's not that you have to agree on everything, but you have to utilize the board with their expertise for strategy and for governance. And those are the two main areas where I focus the board, or try to help the board stay focused in our interactions. I'm a bit unique as well, because when CSL privatized from government, there's a Parliamentary Corporations Act that was imposed because they thought the company would fail under privatization. And so it requires a listing on the ASX. It requires that 2/3 of my board members have to be Australian citizens. And it requires that the chairman of the board has to be an Australian citizen. And so that does make it a bit different for me, because there's a lot of focus in Australia, there's no doubt. But by the same token, we've refreshed the board with a lot of people that are either returning to Australia or recent Australian citizens that have global biotech and pharma experience, because it's really bringing them into the fold for that. You need a lawyer too. You need that protection. So
Let me clarify that. You need a lawyer, or you should have a lawyer?
yes.
All right, one last question. I appreciate your insights on how leaders, including many of us here today, can enable an innovation to flourish in their organizations. If there's just one piece of advice that you could offer on how best to foster a culture of innovation in an organization, what would that be?
Well, it's hard to say one thing, Kelvin, but I'll try to hone it down to one thing, and that's the right people in your organization. I mean, it's about you can't do this without the people, right? I mean, we can put as much AI and digital into it as we want, but you need the people that have insight that can bring that innovation mindset to your business. And that's, people ask me, you're a big company, you're a CEO of a global company, what keeps you up at night? And my answer is always the same: people. I mean, plants can blow up, things can go wrong, but if you don't have the right people, then it's going to be very, very difficult to innovate and to continue to drive forward. So innovation is about the people you hire, the culture you put in place for those people to operate in. And I think that's really the key.
Paul, this has just been fabulous. We are so fortunate to have you in our midst, and we are fortunate that you were willing to participate with us today. I can't even imagine how busy you are. Maybe COVID benefited us that way because you're still home and not able to travel quite as much. So we were able to squeeze in an hour of your time, but you were most gracious to be able to spend time with us today. I know there are many people that are interested in this. We are going to be posting this particular interview and talk on our website so that people can have access to it, because it is fascinating information and it is a must listen to for anybody that wants to foster innovation in their organization. So we appreciate what you're doing, your support of us and our BioHive initiative. Our BioHive is going to be the equivalent of Silicon Slopes in the high-tech industry. And I think, as you suggest, as we combine those two efforts, we'll see a lot of success. So this concludes our business and awards session. We thank all of you for joining us. We will have, starting at 1 o'clock to 4:30, our regulatory compliance and quality section, talking about the MDR. We're going to talk about EUAs. We're going to talk about risk management. So any of you regulatory types, be sure and join us at 1 o'clock. Enjoy your lunch. Thank you for being with us.